Folks, just before we begin, those of you who are on the back row, if you want, I'm not saying you have to, if you would like to come and sit, there are some chairs around here as well so that we can sit in more of a circle when we get to the conversation later on. You're very welcome. Wonderful. Well, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Chester Cathedral, to the refectory here this evening for what I know will be a really rich and thought-provoking conversation as we mark the 40th anniversary of the Faith in the City report. My name's Canon Anthony, the Canon Missioner here. I just wanted to give a couple of notices before we begin, and then I'm going to hand over to Dean Tim, who's going to lead the discussion this evening. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you do want to get yourselves another tea or coffee at any point, please do feel free and feel able to do that. And the toilets, if you haven't found them already, are straight through the door at the back there. One of the things that we're really proud of and delighted about here at the Cathedral is our close association with Transforming Lives Together and the amazing work that they do across the diocese. It's really wonderful to be able to work in partnership with them, and I'm really pleased that Ruth and Andrew here so that they can share a little bit more about the work that TLT do for those of you particularly who perhaps haven't come across their work before. Ruth, Andrew.
So Andrew, Chairman of the Board of Trustees for Transforming Lives Together, and just to introduce the charity to you, we're an independent charity working in partnership with Chester Cathedral and the Diocese of Chester. Historically, we've been part of the Together network with similar charities across the country, working closely with the Church Urban Fund. We're motivated by our Christian faith to tackle poverty, loneliness and social inequality by enabling churches to better understand their communities and reach and service those that they know are in need. Transforming Lives Together is really a locally based faith in action, people-driven advocate for social justice. We aim to bring people together by stimulating and supporting individual churches in their social action to help communities flourish and thrive across Chester Diocese, which interestingly includes 11 different local authorities in one diocese, from Wirral to Wrexham, from Warrington to Stockport, and everywhere in between. We especially focus on poverty of food and social isolation. The project strengthens children's well-being, family resilience, and diverse communities, bringing them together to combat holiday hunger and adult loneliness, building relationships between people and their communities and churches, fostering strong bonds and social networks. And we're really grateful for the hundreds of volunteers who are in individual churches, some of which are here today as well. All of those bakers and cooks and drivers and caregivers, knitters, conversation makers, prayers and fundraisers. Inspired by our Christian values, our projects service everybody in the community regardless of their background and beliefs, and funded entirely by individuals, donations, churches and some generous sponsors, charitable trusts and charities. Our two flagship programmes are Places of Welcome and Filling the Gap. Places of Welcome, as you will know I'm sure, is a network of over 600 spaces offering an unconditional welcome to local people to connect and contribute to each other for a few hours every week. We now have 58 places of welcome in the diocese, 3 more just added recently, where anybody can go for a friendly face, a cup of tea and a conversation in all sorts of churches and community centres, and for the first time here, also in a cathedral. Filling the Gap is our project with a network of churches delivering food and activities during the school holidays, enabling children and families to eat healthy food and play together. They build relationships with parents, and the children thrive. Often children who would normally have free school meals, but that's not provided, of course, in the school holidays. And our newest ventures have been away from urban areas a little bit. They have their obvious issues and hardship where many social agencies operate, but increasingly we're aware of communities within Chester Diocese that are rural, and they have those hidden needs of isolation from practical support and social connection. Do check out the website if you want to know more. Just search Transforming Lives Together, you'll find it. We're also looking for new trustees. So if anybody has a passion for social justice and would like to join us as a trustee, collar me later. But it's personal stories that make the difference. And I'm just going to invite Ruth to share a couple of brief stories with us.
Good evening, I'm Ruth Bull and I'm the Community Missioner with Transforming Lives Together. And Andrew just asked me just to share a few little stories. These stories are just a tiny, tiny fraction of the stories that are going on all over the Diocese of Chester every day. So one of the things about a place of welcome is intergenerational friendship. At one place of welcome, they're open over hours where children can come and attend, as well as older folks. And at one of them, a lady in her 80s and her husband, who is registered blind, found companionship in a place of welcome. A teenager who attends began helping the husband to knead dough during one of those bread-making activities. And from there, a very genuine friendship has grown. And the wife says that this place of welcome is the only time of the week where I feel like I'm not on duty and I can relax. It's also a place where people can feel empowered. At another place of welcome, a woman who attends the food bank stayed on to attend the place of welcome. She has a challenging home life. She has a life of addiction and struggles with her mental health. And she found joy in serving others, because one of the things about a place of welcome is that you're invited to participate. It's not just you sit and you get served. It's actually you can actively serve others and be involved. And she said with a big grin, "I love it here. I feel like I can help other people for a change." And also another thing about a place of welcome is kindness. At the place of welcome here at Chester Cathedral, we welcome people from all over the world. Val does a wonderful job of welcoming people. We are in the top 10 attractions in the world according to TripAdvisor. How wonderful is that? But we also welcome, in that place of welcome, a number of regulars who have found a place where they are known, welcomed and loved. One regular attendee summed it up while doing a jigsaw. The thing about this place is everyone is kind to one another. And beyond this, our Fill in the Gap projects, as Andrew has said, support families during school holidays with free meals and activities. For some children, just this summer, it meant their very first trip ever to the seaside. And the lady who was operating that Fill in the Gap project said, "I loved the chuckles as children felt the sand for the very first time. The astonishing thing is those children only live 20 minutes from the beach." The reports of children that bring empty sandwich boxes to school and pretend to eat are actually all too real. That happens in our school classrooms. One teacher in Stockport reported a child coming into her class in reception with an apple that she had fished out of the bin wrapped in a sanitary towel because she wanted something to eat. Our Fill in the Gap projects provide a space where everyone is fed and where activities are provided for all the family. You can see these are real stories, real people, and we can make a real difference. And thank you to all of you that do.
Wow, thank you, Ruth and Andrew, and stories that really root us in the reality of life. It's really good to see you all. Thank you for coming this evening. A little bit about Assemble. Assemble is a series of evenings we try to set up. Well, we do set up. We successfully set up that provide an opportunity for engagement with some of the big issues of our day for the people of Chester. I don't know how many of you experience Chester, but I experience the city as a place that's quite quiet and that steps away from some of the tough conversations of our world today. And so we're trying to be provocative with many of the subjects that we bring to Assemble. Today we've brought, for the first time, an issue that the church was on the front foot for. Many of the issues, like who owns the moon, are quite remote issues for the church. Although a huge issue, Elaine, when you think about territorialism in the world today and the way that nations are. So this conversation is set in that context of a series of public square debates. I hope that you will be able to engage with the debate. So the intention is not just me quizzing panellists, but the intention is, please, if there's questions you want to ask, if there's comment that you want to make, please do catch our eye. Anthony has got a roving microphone. We won't be interrupting one another, so the opportunity to do that will be when somebody has finished speaking, but do catch our eye. I will try to chair it and ensure good order. This year is the 40th anniversary of the publication of the report Faith in the City. And we wanted to look back at where society was 40 years ago, where the church was, and where we are today, and see whether there were things to celebrate that report has brought about, things of change. So we have collected a panel of people who have real experience around this. Rob Wickham, who is in the middle, thank you for coming, Rob. Rob is Chief Executive Officer for the Church Urban Fund, which TLT acts as a part of, or, yeah, in partnership with, thank you. A national charity committed to working with local communities to tackle issues such as poverty and isolation, motivated by a vision of the world as God intends it to be. Formerly Bishop of Edmonton, Rob has many years of experience working in an urban context in Tyneside and Hackney. I don't know whether you've connected with John Stanley, who sat in the big red buggy just there, but John, I think you were one of the founder trustees of the Church Urban Fund. So all sorts of experience about Cuff here in the room. Jenny Sinclair. Jenny, our paths have crossed tentatively in the past. I was a great admirer of Jenny's dad and was privileged to work with him for 3 years when David Shepherd was Bishop of Liverpool. I was his chaplain. Jenny is founder and director of Together for the Common Good, a Christian charity dedicated to spiritual and civic renewal, working with leaders, churches and schools. T4CG empowers people to make sense of this time of seismic change and play their part for the common good. And Tim Stevens, next to me here, is a former boss of mine, former Bishop of Leicester, former convener of the Lord's Spiritual. After ministering as a parish priest in East London and Essex, he became urban officer to the Bishop of Chelmsford at the time when Faith in the City was published. Whilst Bishop of Leicester, Tim was also chair of the Children's Society and is now chair of trustees for the Wolf Institute, an independent interfaith research institute in Cambridge. And let me just tell you a little bit about me and where I was when Faith in the City was published. And then I'm going to ask each of our panellists what impact Faith in the City had for them, or where they were when this report was published. I know I don't look old enough, but in 1985 I was at Theological College. I was probably too young to be there. I was studying at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. Previously, I'd grown up in an outer estate area of Liverpool called Huyton. John was the vicar. How many years, John? Was it 50 years you clocked up as vicar of Huyton? Oh, 45, I've over-egged it. So John was my vicar. I married his daughter, and Hythe was a really tough place to grow up in. I went to a school where 70% of the people who went to school received free school meals. I didn't receive a free school meal. Probably not because I wasn't entitled to a free school meal, but because my parents wouldn't want their children to receive free school meals. It was a tough place. As a child, I found it a confusing place. You never knew if you were cornered by a group of kids who were bigger than you. You never knew what answer to give them when they asked you a question. But if you gave the wrong answer, you were going to be beaten up. And I found life confusing and tough as a child growing up there. My way out was through education as best as I could access education. I studied electronics at university in York, and then found myself having discerned a call to the ministry at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, and was on a journey away from the sort of community that I had grown up in. And Faith in the City was published whilst I was at theological college, and it enabled me to see the community I'd grown up in a completely different light, and encouraged me to see that actually, having grown up in that community, I was uniquely placed to go back and make a difference working in the outer estates of Liverpool. I learned a great deal, Jenny, working with your dad. I spent 20 years as a priest in two outer estates, an area called Norris Green and an outer estate area called Kirby, both on the northeast edge of Liverpool. And still have a deep love for those places. And it was the publication of this report that changed the direction of my ministry. Now I'm going to play the same question back to the three of you. What impact have you seen from the publication of this report, in particular, if it's had an impact upon you? I don't know who wants to start. Tim.
Is this switched on? Can I be heard? I think I'm here as a kind of visual aid, really, for the longevity of Faith in the City. And of course, it was published halfway between the end of the Second World War and today. It is a kind of hinge point, historically, culturally, socially, and ecclesiastically in so many ways. And I'm here to confess it was pretty much halfway through my life as well. The question is, what impact did it have? It had lots of impacts. Others will say more. Tim's already said some things about his story. But for me, the greatest impact was the connection between the gospel imperative for personal care, concern, kindness, compassion for the poor, and the church's responsibility to address the injustices, the societal injustices which lead to poverty. So it was both to address the need for what you might call ambulance work, but also the need to have a voice in changing the way the nation functions. It was, of course, published in the mid-1980s. The Labour Party at the time was languishing. The Social Democratic Party had been launched and was seen to be riding high. Michael Foot, the hard left leader of the Labour Party, didn't have the sympathies in the nation that meant there was a clear alternative voice to Thatcherism in the 80s. And it was, I think, the courage of Robert Runcie and the people around him which enabled the church to say, we will be that voice. So these are the two things that it's impacted on me. One, the absolute imperative that the church can't just be an ambulance service for the poor and the victims of injustice, but must also be the advocate for them. And secondly, that it takes courage and it's risky for the church to enter this space on the side of the poor, and to do that as a matter of conviction, and to do it in a sustained way. And the question that I bring to the discussion tonight is, can we be clear what's changed to make it apparently much harder for the church to do that today? Does the church have the conviction, the courage, the confidence, and even the appetite for having that kind of voice today? If it does, what would that voice need to look like? Those are the questions that I bring. On my personal journey, it took me, rather to my surprise, I was in South Essex ministering in a parish of 40,000 at the time, trying to address the deep injustices there by building a family centre in partnership with the Children's Society. And I was asked to leave that work and go back to East London, work in 5 London boroughs, and spent the next 3 years in conversation with the local authorities, generating initiatives to address poverty in those boroughs. After 3 years, we had nearly 40 projects and programmes working through the newly created Church Urban Fund at that time. But it led me on a trajectory which eventually, to my surprise, took me into Parliament, and to doing what I could over and over again to raise the injustices in Parliament that I felt were being done during what we now call austerity, following the 2010 election and the devastating consequences of that for many people. And I just leave you with one memory, really, which was that after leading an attempt to get an amendment to a government bill in the House of Lords on the welfare reform bill, and the whole question of a cut to benefits if you had more than 2 children, we got an amendment to that, which was subsequently defeated in the Commons. But getting a call and saying, you've got to get down to Shepherd's Bush to go on Newsnight to be interrogated by Jeremy Paxman. And I think it's true to say that it was the courage and the conviction behind Faith in the City and all the debates that flowed from it that led me to be clear that actually it was absolutely vital. I had a whole bunch of other things I needed to be doing that night, was to go on live TV and explain for about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour why it absolutely was the responsibility of the bishops to do this. And I believe it still is, and that this is a journey we need to think hard and long about how to recover that ground and that voice in a very different age today.
Tim, thank you. Rob, I'll come to you next, and just remind those of you who are sat around, please, if the contributions that you're hearing are generating questions or provoking you, do indicate, and I'll make sure you can respond. Rob.
So if I were to tell you that I was at school when the report came out, which will give something of my own age away, I was at secondary school, which probably helps even more. And I went to a posh public school in southwest London. And what Faith in the City did for me was the fact that the church which I attended got really behind it. And what the church did for this 13, 14-year-old lad was to suddenly open up a very different set of stories. Stories of individuals who are experiencing deep poverty. It would probably be described now as deep poverty. And we did all sorts of fundraising for it. I remember the little red tea lights. Perhaps you remember the little red tea lights as well. They were part of the fundraising campaign when we first began the Church Urban Fund. And what that then led on was a series of thinking through as to why is it, here am I in my privilege, why is it that vast numbers of people in our nation were having a very, very different experience of life to the one that I was having? That then led on to, as I say, all sorts of questions. It led on to me doing a geography degree, which was rooted in issues around urban regeneration and rooted in kind of narrative stories about places and why places feel differently and the effect that poverty has on those places. And then I had my conversion year, which was rooted to the Faith in the City report. So I went out of the places where I was normally kind of inhabiting, as I've said before, and I spent a year working on a church, partly for the church itself, in a place called St Luke's in Wallsend, on Tyneside, at the time that Swanhunter Shipyard was closing down. My granddad worked at Swanhunter Shipyard. So therefore the issues which I saw around me, suddenly being immersed in a very different environment, suddenly became personal, they became real. And so half my time was spent working on this estate, doing youth work, listening to people's experience, listening to people's stories, at the time when there was distinct, rapid poverty level increases. If you remember in the late 80s, this is the early 90s, over the course of that time, poverty levels almost doubled in this country. They've remained at that level, they've not gone down. We've just got used to it. But it was that time when there was all sorts of degrees of anger bubbling around. The riots in Newcastle had just happened in the early 1990s. And half my time, as I say, was spent on an estate called the Ridges Estate, the Meadowell Estate. It's there in the report, it's written about in the report. And on that particular estate, we had various pockets of it where 80% of men were unemployed. And that was the place where the church-based drop-in centre where I was working on that estate was trying to create a sense of hope and a sense of being able to imagine things differently. And they did it in this most remarkable and imaginative way. And there was one particular story I want to share with you, which is why these sorts of stories and listening to stories, listening to that sense of narrative, listening to the voices of the other, and not just perceiving that you know where they're coming from, was the fact that it was on Good Friday, well, Maundy Thursday. Do you know when you do the watch through the night? Some churches do the watch through the night, Maundy Thursday to Good Friday. And being the kind of OIC pastoral assistant, the vicar, a guy called John Inge, who's just retired, said to me, well, Rob, you're the pastoral assistant. You can do the 3 till 5 slot in church. Because that's what you do, and you just say yes in those situations, don't you? So there's me sitting in this church building in Wallsend, going into Good Friday, 3 till 5 in the morning. I thought 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm not going to go back to bed. So I went for a little wander. And I wandered, it took me to the gates of Swan Hunters, which at that moment was just in the process of closing down. And I think for this work, there is a distinct Christian calling, because I heard God's voice. And God's voice said to me, Rob, you are to be rooted in listening to the voices of communities like this one. And it's from that conversion moment that took me to where I served my curacy in Willesden, in an area of deprivation on a big estate in Willesden. I then became the vicar of King's Cross, that part of London, if you know it, with the extreme levels of poverty which exist on those estates. I then became the rector of Hackney, where 42% of children were growing up in poverty. Yet you could not buy a 2-bedroom property for less than £500,000. That is injustice. And it's being rooted and listening to people's experiences in each of those different settings that actually, for me, makes Faith in the City report come alive, because the commission itself was rooted in real life. It was rooted in stories, in narrative. And that, for me, captures something of what we need to perhaps even reimagine in the life of the church now.
Rob, thank you very much. There's a lot of passion in the report, and it provokes passion in us. Thank you. Jenny.
Hello everybody, so nice to see you and see some friends here too. So in 1985 I was estranged from the church, and I need to backtrack a little bit. I was 23 and I grew up where the language of Faith in the City was the meat and drink of our kitchen table. And it's like going back in time, being in the company of bishops, because that's what my childhood was like. So all of those ideas that came out in Faith in the City were very much what I grew up with. And of course, my father published Bias to the Poor in 1983, which is a very important step towards Faith in the City. But I wasn't part of the church. I was very estranged, as I say. I was much more interested when I was growing up in the music scene in Liverpool. And I moved away from home and I wasn't involved. But in my mid-20s, I had a conversion experience and I was received into the Catholic Church. I lived a quiet life and nothing particularly remarkable happened. I worked in graphic design for many years. I had children, started a family. And it wasn't until my mid-40s in 2011 that the work I'm doing now, Together for the Common Good, first occurred to me. Now, this is connected with Faith in the City, in the sense that I was formed, as I say, by my father's interests. It's a very, our whole family was geared towards my father's mission, so it shaped me, no question. And no matter how far I tried to get away from it, I even went as far as China, it followed me. And so later on in life, I actually felt a prompting of the Holy Spirit in my life, quite unexpectedly, wasn't what I was looking for. And this drew me. It was 2011, if you might remember the Tottenham riots that summer. And I remember thinking, where's the church response? What's going on? Why is it so different from the Faith in the City high watermark, as we mentioned before? And I thought there's something gone wrong here. The church is not fit for purpose. And I was sensing what we can all now see as the beginning of the unravelling. We're experiencing a huge political, cultural, social upheaval across the West. And I think I was just beginning to sense it in 2011. And so I prayed and I followed what I felt the Holy Spirit was drawing me to. And over a couple of years, Together for the Common Good was formed. And really what has inspired it was when I was first thinking about this, I was speaking to people that had worked with my father and with Archbishop Warlock, just following clues, really. I didn't quite know what I was doing, but it was about how the church engages with society, particularly how the church relates to poor communities. That was one of our major concerns. And that led us to do some research and look at how churches work together to engage with poor communities. And then along that journey, quite early on, somebody introduced me to the tradition of Catholic social thought. And although I'd become a Catholic many years before, no one had told me about it. Now, this is a huge tradition. It goes back to 1891, the modern era anyway. Obviously, it goes back centuries, but the modern era of Catholic social thought goes back to 1891. And when I discovered this, really as a way of reading the world, it's a framework for good judgment. It speaks about a whole range of things, from family to bioethics to political economy to work to evangelization, all kinds of aspects. And it opened up for me a way of diagnosing what had happened in our country. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because although Faith in the City had such an important impact, and I acknowledge that impact, I meet clergy all the time who tell me it made all the difference in my ministry, it transformed my life, it's why I'm in the church. So many people say this. However, and I will be the voice of the critique here, I'm only interested in talking about Faith in the City to learn what wasn't quite right about it and how we should be approaching this subject differently now. And what I think the problem was, and I know I'm not the only person to say this, is that I think that its theology failed to understand the big project of neoliberalism adequately. And so if you don't understand the problem, you can't make an adequate response. Now, the problem is now that, as Rob said, poverty is just as bad as it was many years ago. It is not reduced. And despite all the wonderful work by many people of goodwill. There's something that is structurally wrong. And what really bothers me, for example, is how food banks have become a built-in component now of a neoliberal economy. We can't do without them, we don't want them, but they're essential. And unfortunately, it means that churches that are running them are inadvertently propping up an unjust system. So we can't call that the work of social justice. It's social action, but it's not justice. And part of my problem now is seeing a church that is very keen to, for example, argue for increases in benefits, but doesn't make a coherent narrative argument for jobs and investment. Why not? So my question really is, whose side is the church on? I think, unfortunately, the church inadvertently got really good at social action, really good at delivering services, but actually forgotten its prophetic edge. And we can see now this neoliberal project. In the UK, we relate it to Thatcherism, but of course it's a much wider phenomenon than that. You know, liberalism is an idea, is an animating idea which has affected the whole of the West. All the countries that bought into this system are seeing the same problems. They're all seeing parts of their countries left behind, huge division, individualism, all the problems that come from that. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more later. But the work of Together for the Common Good helps people to understand what's going on and also to advocate for the antidote. The antidote to this is building relationships. And that might sound too simple, but really that is what we need to be doing. The church needs to become more relational. So we work with churches, charities and schools in various different ways and creative ways to encourage them to play their part for the common good, to rebuild what's broken, to rebuild the social fabric.
Jenny, well, thank you very much. This is getting us into some of the real stuff and the debate of today. Thank you, the three of you. Has that got any of you going, and is there anything that any of you would like to raise at this stage? Please.
So sorry if I don't need to speak.
It'll just help us all here if we pass the microphone around.
Well, Jenny just mentioned something that's been buzzing around in my head from the beginning, is that Thatcher was 79 to 8. When was she? She was 79 to 96. And Thatcher, the milk stealer, Thatcher, the miners' strike, Thatcher, the destruction of... I could get excited when I talk about Thatcher. She had to swallow faith in the city, and we allowed her to do it. I mean, the answer has to be political, doesn't it? In terms of, it is the capitalist system that generates the poor and the downtrodden, and we fix it, we mend it, and we make it. I mean, it is said that it was Wesley that stopped the revolution in Wales by the Welsh revival. There should have been a revolution. We need a revolution. We need a Christian revolution to start. Oh, please, Jesus, Maranatha, may the kingdom of God come soon.
Thank you. You've got Tim going now. Do you want to respond to that at all, Tim? I think that was a bit of E.P. Thompson there. Oh, here we are. You're getting the microphone, look.
It does raise the question in terms of Wesley. Thank you for mentioning him. I'm a Methodist. Because, you know, was Wesley a social reformer? I don't think he was, but he raised some very, very pertinent questions of social justice, and he addressed the question of poverty in micro projects, which engaged the people called Methodists in doing the works of compassion and mercy on the ground, and it was very much involved with personal care. But tackling the political systems, I don't think Wesley did that. Later Methodists did in the late 19th century, and Wesley, of course, was the inspiration for that. But we better not make Wesley the great revolutionary. He wasn't.
Thank you, Tim. There we are. You're both on the same page. Now, we'll come back to a question over here. Let's hear this, and then I'll draw us back to the question I've got.
Yes, I only came on the spur of the moment today. because I only just found out about it. I used to work in Liverpool in the days we are talking about. There was extreme poverty. There was desperation. Society was breaking down. People were scared of revolution, certainly politically scared of there being an uprising. And there was, of course, an uprising in Toxteth, which happened in my time. I was much engaged at the time in urban initiatives and administering the urban programme at that time. And with the churches of all sorts of denominations were extremely active and in promoting community-run projects. The notion was something to do with empowering people to take more control of their own lives, and if they did that, they could change things. And of course, much good things actually happened in that context. But I remember being challenged by a Marxist friend of mine who once said, well, actually, no amount of community development is going to defeat the flight of capital from Liverpool, which of course is what happened in terms of the collapse of the ocean trades and the docks and so on. And that was really quite a challenge, and I'm quite interested really in what people think about that remark. I'm also wondering, because people have touched upon that, what has changed since then? Because we really thought this was going to do things for really quite a while, and it was, as you say, promoted very much by the Conservative government, these kinds of community projects, more so than I have to say the Labour Party ever did, and deeply opposed by the Liberals. And there were a lot of these programmes and initiatives. Liverpool was full of them. It was a whole industry. And yet I leave myself wondering, what impact did they actually have at a macro level? As I say, a great deal of good was done, but I remember David Shepherd and Warlock, and I'm desperately trying to
John Newton.
Remember the Free Church?
John Newton.
That was it. And those people, Edward Patey in the cathedral. And I remember a group of renegade Catholic nuns who were sort of subversive characters in their local community. Well, in Toxteth and in Croxteth and places like that. And I just wonder, I mean, how does that relate to the position we are in today? Because today I look at what's happening to the Church of England in terms of its resources and assets and clergy. I'm also wondering whether we were totally wise to focus so much on geography. In my parish, which is quite a well-off one, there is deprivation and suffering and injustice, just as what there was then.
Thank you very much. So let's take that question on. I'll frame it for the panel. And you rightly set the research and publication of Faith in the City against the background of the Toxteth riots. So one of the things that happened with the publication of Faith in the City was that it looked at inner city life, but concluded that the most severe deprivation that there was to be found in the UK was in the outer estates of large cities. I just wonder, your question, sir, what has changed? What has changed in the inner cities? Because they have changed. And what has changed on the outer estates? Have they changed? Rob, I think that question probably best lands with you first, but if others want to reflect as well, please do.
So that's a really helpful question, and I think that the shape and what poverty looks like is obviously different now than it was in 1985 when the report came out. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation is really helpful in giving us an annual update in terms of poverty statistics, in terms of what that shape, and every year it takes on a slightly different guise. So in terms of the shape of poverty now, clearly a lot of our inner cities have been hugely regenerated. Sorry, I'm going to use a different term, hugely gentrified. Regeneration is actually about baptism theology. Gentrification is about money. And so we've seen an awful lot of gentrification in our inner cities taking place, which has meant the shape of poverty isn't quite as, certainly in our cities, isn't quite as it's in that place and not that place. It's actually more spread out. Some of the poverty is more hidden. Poverty as well, we've heard about outer estates. Poverty on outer estates continues to be quite extreme in many places. The levels of rural poverty have also increased, particularly when we think of poverty not just about material poverty, but also poverty of identity and particularly relational poverty. And we've seen through our facts and figures and data and so on that the numbers of people experiencing relational poverty increases and increases. The Children's Society, as Tim will say, will remind us that our children are the most unhappy in Europe now. Joseph Rowntree Foundation will tell us that 30% of children are growing up in poverty. They will also tell us, of course, that 24% of the population live in poverty now, of which 6%, there's a new category that's been developed, 6% of the population are now living in deep poverty. And the matrix are there is in terms of what increases in material and relational kind of wealth, as it were, would enable them to be lifted out of poverty. So this new category, which is extraordinarily, it's like the kind of underpour, as it were, which is now being kind of recognised and looked at. The other thing is the racial element that exists in here and the issues which relate also to people living with disabilities. And if you have a disability or someone in your family has a disability, the levels of poverty are distinctly higher than they are when there is no disability. Likewise with a number of Pakistani families or a number of Bangladeshi families, the levels of poverty, I haven't got them in front of me, but the levels of poverty are significantly higher than in other parts of the population. So actually it's become much, much more kind of patchwork. It's not just geographically rooted, as it were. There's something here about the networks. There's something here about different ethnicities and so on and so forth, which lend into these elements of what poverty looks like. But the important thing, it seems to me, is the levels of poverty now are just as high as they were in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And to go back in terms of one of those things that you're describing about what's changed, what I think has changed is that we're no longer angry about it. We're no longer concerned, and we've just come to accept that this is the norm, which I think kind of feeds into the political reflections that Jenny is offering. And that's the thing that deeply concerns me. We just accept it as something that we live with. And I think from a Christian perspective, where we talk about Jesus coming that we may have life in all its fullness, and we're asked the question at the beginning of the scriptures of, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sibling's keeper? There's something for me here about responsibility. There's something here about the echoing the words of Jeremiah, is that we are here to seek the welfare of the city, because in their welfare, in that welfare, we will find our own welfare. So there's something here about responsibility. There's something about recognising that actually this isn't the government's responsibility, but actually this is the church's responsibility, and that makes it my responsibility and your responsibility about the way in which we respond. And I think for me that's something there about that which we need to perhaps even recapture.
Rob, thank you. You said in your opening words before about how you noticed as a relatively prosperous teenager or young adult that there were other people whose experience of life was a very different experience to yours. Jenny, your dad used to talk about the two Britons, and there were two Britons that didn't really see each other, that were blind to each other. One of the metrics that the government used that emerged out of Faith in the City was an index of multiple deprivation. And whilst you've used the word poverty, they use the word deprivation to capture this is much more than a financial thing. And I know when you talk about poverty, you're not just talking about financial poverty, but multiple deprivation demonstrated that when a community is deprived of one thing, which might be money, or it might be education, or it might be health, or it might be education, when it's deprived of one thing, you often find it's deprived of all of them. And deprivation is not that the community has done this to itself, but that society withholds these things that are normal in one Britain from the other Britain. Jenny?
Yeah, I just want to reflect on that, the two Britons you were talking about. I think we've now got several Britons. We're fragmented. And this is no accident. When I was talking earlier about this animating idea of liberalism that underpins this era that we're in, it has that tendency. It's actually based on a false anthropology. It's based on the idea of the human being being an isolated individual. And I think most of us as Christians know that's not true. We know that we were made in the image of God as relational beings, that we thrive in relationship. And the problem with this era of neoliberalism, which actually is not, may have been, we first recognised it with Thatcher and Reagan, but it went on through Blair, it went on through Cameron, and it's carrying on today. It's still not been challenged properly. And this is why we're seeing this unravelling now. This is why we see a breakdown of trust in society. It's why we see an epidemic of loneliness. All of these things are not incidental. They all flow from this very powerful bad idea. And I think when Rob's talking about relational poverty, I mean, again, as Christians, it should be part of our purpose, what it means to be a Christian, to be relational. Say, I'm going to intentionally build relationships. That should be part of our holistic evangelization, if you like. It's not about Bible bashing or proselytizing. It's about how we live, and we make those choices as almost like a resistance against this kind of liberal hegemony that wants us to be atomized, living at home, ordering on Amazon, never seeing anybody, not knocking on the next door neighbor, can I borrow something, but actually I'll buy it instead. Or my primary relationship is with the state or a business rather than with my neighbour. This is what we've lost over this period. We've lost a huge amount of community trust. A lot of the power has floated up to the centralised state, or we've outsourced it to Google, to Amazon, all these different, Uber, we order food. We've actually forgotten how to cook. We've outsourced all of these things that should be in our power as communities. So I think it's really important to have this conception of poverty in different forms, and it all flows from this very bad idea.
Thank you. Tim?
Well, I completely agree with Jenny, and the question that's coming into my mind is that sooner or later we have to face the fact that this heresy of neoliberalism has not just infected our society, but has infected our church. And I don't think it's being talked about enough, and I don't think anyone is naming it. And until that happens, we may go on being angry or irritated around the edges, but we won't have credibility or energy or the power to address the fundamental problem. So I see isolation in some of our church congregations. I have known what it is when my wife died to go to church and come out feeling that was not Holy Communion, it was unholy desolation. And God has given us in the Church of England 16,000 centres of relationship, churches with potentially Eucharistic communities called to live out this new relational life. But I don't think we're doing it with anything like the confidence and seeing that that is the great resistance movement to this heresy. I think the church has become preoccupied with itself, with its own reputation, with its own growth, and it has monetized its mission so that every penny it spends has to have a certain return. It's infected with this way of thinking. And my question is, where is the resistance to that going to come from? Because until we face that, as it were, within our own economy, well, we're not going to have the capacity to bring it to the attention of the nation. Maybe this is on the in tray of whoever becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, but actually that's a ridiculous statement. It's for the whole church. And I think, you know, you were pointing out some of the symptoms of neoliberalism in our society, but you can see them almost wherever you look in the church. The way the General Synod behaves, the mistrust inherent in our institutional relationships, the deep mistrust in the House of Bishops, that some of the dysfunction in our leadership, it's all there, and it's all because this essentially relational understanding of human flourishing has evaporated in large parts of the church as well, I would say. Not all of it, of course, but it's a significant part.
Tim, thank you. I'm going to draw you a bit more shortly on that, all three of you. Just wondering whether there is anything else that's, please, yeah. And then you, Elaine. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I might be the only one here, but could somebody just give a very brief account of the heresy of neoliberalism for me? Thank you.
A brief...
Do you want me to?
Yes, a brief account. One minute on neoliberalism.
Very briefly. If you think about there's a description of an idea called the unencumbered self. The self that doesn't need anybody. I don't need my family, I don't need tradition, I don't need borders, I don't need constraint. I'm focused entirely on my self-actualization. Individualism is the shorthand, yes.
And on the other hand, we have the idea that it takes a village to bring up a child.
Quite, exactly.
Yeah.
But that idea, you see, plays out socially, economically, culturally. So that's why you get the Big Bang in 1979 of freedom markets, freed from any constraint. So money can flow anywhere it likes. This is the philosophy underpinning the whole thing, is freedom from constraint.
Elaine.
Thank you very much.
Follow that.
If the church was to recapture the spirit of faith in the city, and if we were to take that on, and I'm hearing the message that it's up to us, well, who is we? Because the landscape of faith has changed radically over the last 40 years. The church, the Archbishop's Commission in 1985 spoke with confidence about addressing recommendations to church and nation. And it had a very clear sense, I think, of itself as the established church. And that was part of its genius, because it was there at parish level, and it kept faith with local communities when businesses and shops and social services were vacating those places. And yet it was able to speak right up into the corridors of power, speak truth to power. I'm not sure the Church of England is that strong anymore, but I think there are allies, other faith-based organisations, other pressure groups and political groups. So if we were to build a broad alliance around the spirit of faith in the city today, what would that community look like?
Who's going to take that on? Who's the we?
I can immediately think of the problems with doing it. I can't so quickly see the answers. One of the problems with alliances with other faiths is the extreme tension that exists between, of course, the Jewish community and the Muslim community at the moment, with relationships that had been built up, which I knew well in Leicester during my time there, now fractured and people deeply alienated from each other. So that makes those kind of alliances, I think, more difficult. The other thing that occurs to me is what are we going to build the alliances around? Rob is encouraging us, I think rightly, or saying he misses the anger. My worry is there's plenty of anger around, and the politics of grievance is gathering huge momentum as we speak. How do we find alliances and a voice which doesn't just sound like more of that, only in a slightly different political colour? That's my question. I have no idea what the answer is, It seems to me to be an important question.
Jenny?
Well, it's part of my work, is building that alliance. And it's not that I set out with a strategy to do it. This is very much, I feel like, my vocation. It's what I feel called to do. So, for example, on Monday night, Rob's coming to an event that I'm organising. I've got 70 leaders in the room representing a whole range of Christian organisations, all denominations, from think tanks to churches to social action organisations to evangelistic to religious orders. So I've made it my business just by being really nosy, like who's doing what and who's interested. And when Tim was saying, what do we centre around? I've found that this way of thinking that Catholic social teaching offers, which is a framework for diagnosis and crucially a constructive response. So it's not just about anger, it's about what can we do that's proactive. And that's hard. It's hard to iterate a narrative, a common good story, because what we've been captured in this, as you were saying, it's a great phrase, the heresy of neoliberalism. We've been captured with a lie, actually, that the kind of life and culture that we've created is somehow about freedom. It's not. It's a form of captivity. And so the Christian narrative, when it's authentic, is about freedom in God. And what does that look like on the ground? And so how do you start to describe what does common good look like in your neighbourhood? What does it look like in a school? What does it look like in a church? What does it look like in business, in a charity? And so that's what we're trying to do. And it's a loose alliance. So we don't have like membership or anything like that. I think that's good because you have a coalition of the willing that gradually grows by attraction rather than by administration. And I'm finding that more and more people want to be a part of this. And I'm part of other networks too. And there's a lot of overlap of all those networks. And I think that's how it develops. I think you can't manufacture a movement. It happens naturally by itself. But one of the key things in Catholic social teaching actually is building relationships between institutions. So I always partner with other organisations out of a point of principle. And that's about building friendship, building trust, and saying we've got shared interests. We might not agree on everything. And that is an inheritance from my father and Archbishop Warlock. We don't agree on a lot of things. We might quite strongly disagree, but we can work together on this. So I think it's that constructive pathway forward that we're looking for.
That's a really helpful question. I'm going to spend a bit of time pondering it over as well, if I may. I think there's something for me about number one, recognising this is the business of the Holy Spirit. This is God's business that we're describing here. I think there's something about how do we lean into the frameworks that we've got. I find, it's a particular kind of Anglican thing, I'm aware, but having a framework of something like the 5 marks of mission is really helpful. In the fact that, yes, we proclaim Jesus Christ. Yes, we are there to serve our local communities, and that's really key. And that's the thing which churches do day in and day out. The work that goes on the ground level in our parishes is remarkable in terms of serving and the clubs. And yes, I'm conscious that it's upholding, it's upkeeping a particular sort of structure. But actually, if we weren't doing that, people's life experience would be very different. I am hugely grateful, as I think you were sort of saying in your in the prayers and things earlier on, about the in your presentation, about it's the people who kind of roll their sleeves up and get their hands dirty. That for me gives me an enormous sense of hope that there are people who are willing to go that extra mile in terms of their local communities. I think there is a great challenge here in terms of we don't ask the right questions, we don't collect. If we're there to challenge unjust structures of society, one of the marks of mission. How do we create and develop the narrative which enables us to do that? Because as part of the atomization that you're describing means that churches see themselves as individual churches, not God's mighty prayer for the world. And there's something here about how do we get a joined up picture, and in the confidence of that, recognizing that we play a part in the Church Catholic doing remarkable things. And how do we take a confidence of the traction of that on the ground level, which then asks the question upstream as to why are people falling in the water in the first place? And I think for me, there's some very creative stuff that's going on, which gives me an enormous sense of hope. So the National Churches Trust, the House of Good report, says that the church's contribution, and it's using the language of the state, I'm aware, but the church's contribution comes to the realm of something like £55 billion a year. That is the contribution of the church. And how do we take those levels of data, and they've now got a tool that you can use on your own churches to work out what the contribution is. How do we do some joined up data, some joined up storytelling, which then means that there is the confidence to ask the difficult questions. You can't ask the difficult questions unless you are clear on your story and unless you've got traction, skin in the game. And we've got skin in the game, but it's atomized. So there's a sense of how do we take that joined up piece, which then means we're in a position to ask those difficult questions. Otherwise, who are you to speak to us? You're just you're part of the world which is just sort of dwindling in number, and that's the narrative. And I think we need to change that narrative.
Just occurs to me as you're speaking that somebody gave me the editorial from the Theos think tank this week about what's happening in Manchester, where a devolution to the Manchester area Mayor Andy Burnham involves all the faiths having a seat at the table and making that contribution to the discourse about the development of the city region. And it's a very interesting description that I wasn't aware of, but it seems to me there's potential in that to be replicated in other places, where the key focal individuals, if they're sympathetic to faith communities, can unlock a space in which the conversation about how the whole city or the whole region develops can take place.
And it's sorry, am I
No, go on.
I'm conscious that when you've got those political dimensions like devolution taking place, then we just need to be really strong in our regions and our cities to respond. And it's exactly the same conversation that we're having around the National Health Service about having much more of a neighbourhood approach. The opportunities for the church to help shape local politics, i.e. the shape of what life looks like. My hope and my prayer is there's something of the Spirit at work in this stuff, which then, if it's about kind of reducing levels of centralisation, then how glorious that is in terms of being able to listen to people's stories, that lived experience. My hope and my prayer, if I'm really honest, is the church will learn how to do that much better, because we've done the opposite in terms of centralisation, in terms of the way in which we do resources.
Let's hope and pray. Elaine, do you want to come back to any of that?
Well, thank you, Rob, picking up on what you said earlier. It's about seeking the welfare of the city and not the survival of the church. But I wonder whether there is a piece of work to be done in getting people together just around a very simple question, which is what makes a good city? What makes a good community? What makes a good neighbourhood? And something like that, allows people to not bury their differences, but actually get to work together on something quite concrete.
Jenny, and then I'm going to press you on a particular place of division in our society at the moment. Yes, respond to Elaine.
Just to respond to that, I think that's exactly the way it should be approached, and that can be taken as an initiative by any local church, for example, reaching out to the businesses, charities and tenants associations and bodies locally. The church can be a convener, can create a space. Let's get together, have a conversation about the common good of our neighbourhood. It can also be done at city level, can be done at regional level. It reminded me very quickly an example. My father and Archbishop Warlock co-chaired a private meeting with all the major employers of in the Liverpool Merseyside region. And I thought, when I was young, I thought they'd done it for a few months, but then I found they did it for 13 years. Breakfast meetings every 6 weeks, Chatham House rule, co-chaired by the bishops. And they had, I think, 12 of the major employers in the region. Now, those people were under pressure from their HQ back in Frankfurt or wherever to say, why are you investing in that basket case of a city? You should pull out. And they said they were together, it helped them stay. So it's difficult to prove a negative, but it's very likely that they may have helped to uphold the well-being of those families and communities who depended upon those jobs. So the church can perform that kind of role behind closed doors. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big voice in public, you know.
Thank you. So that's one way of looking at how we can work together. Let me push you from the bottom up as well. What was happening in the ferment that led to Faith in the City, and the report put its finger on, certainly as I was understanding it as a young man in 1985, was that Britain was realising, or the Church of England was realising, that Britain was a divided society, and Britain hadn't fully faced the truth that it was. 3 weeks ago, I drove up from Dover to Chester, returning from my holidays. And I saw something I'd not seen before in this country, which was flags which are a symbol of our unity and our common identity, on every motorway bridge as a sign of our disunity. And wondering again whether we are experiencing a society where people who feel they are on the margins of the society are a sign of a division which deeply underlies who we are. Whether or not that's the case, how, with the divisions that there are in our society at the moment, what do we learn from Faith in the City, and what is it that we should be doing? And that's, Jenny's story was a story of how bishops could work with business leaders. But many of us won't have access to those business leaders. So in the life of every individual who's in this room and who enters the doors of this cathedral, what would you want to say to them about the divided society we experience today?
I think I see it from the edge, really, both from retirement and from living in rural Suffolk. But the sense that I have is that we live in a society where everybody feels, to some extent, part of a powerless minority. The political map of the country is much more fragmented. After years of oscillating between Conservative and Labour governments, we now have a much more a fragmented political picture. And people have lost a sense of strong identity. It seems to me that the St. George's flags flying, far from being a sign of confidence, display something rather different to that, which is a loss of confidence, actually, in many ways, in who we are. And we now identify ourselves as over against the other. And so migration has become the hot button political issue of the day, as it so often is, because that's a very convenient other for us to identify ourselves against. I have to say I don't find the flags reassuring. I find them to some extent alienating, really. And my question that it's been going around in my head, really, since Jenny first talked about neoliberalism and the consequences of it and the symptoms of it in terms of individualism and alienation, is, are we talking about a gradualist recapture of a common vision that perhaps Faith in the City articulated, to which the church could make a contribution? Or are we frankly talking about something rather more revolutionary, which is a process of subverting this entire neoliberal project, which, as Jenny says, it now infects the whole political environment of the West? And I do think at some point we have to ask ourselves that question, because simply getting back to faith in the city is not an option for us. It's what do we go forward into, and can the present political agenda deliver for us the just and peaceful society we all want to see?
Thank you. I'm not going to invite any more response. Do you really want to respond to the question? I'll let Jenny respond briefly, and then I'm going to finish, unless there's anybody burning. Okay. Jenny, quick response. Andrew, quick question, and then I'm going to finish with a question which will require a one-sentence answer from each of you. Jenny, then Andrew.
I'll try and be brief. A priest friend of mine in East London, Canning Town, actually where I grew up, said to me last week, Jenny, I've got a dilemma. He said, I usually have the Union flag flying, and I've been away for a few weeks, and I want to put it back, but if I put it back, it might send a message, given that everyone's so sensitive about flags now. What should I do? I said, you should put it up. We should not be ceding the use of our flag to the right. And we've got very little time. I'd love to have much longer here, but one of the things I do feel very strongly about is that the church has become captured by a middle-class progressivist mindset, which has alienated it from the working class. Mm-hmm. The fallout of the neoliberal project, not least, has been the leaving behind of large parts of our society, post-industrial towns, the outsourcing of jobs to the Far East. This has never been corrected in 45 years. So people's sense of grievance is genuine. It's not just a feeling. They don't just feel left behind, they have been left behind. The church has failed to stand in solidarity with those people. And now their pushback against globalization, which by the way I agree with, because neoliberalism leads to globalization, so we ought to be standing with them. The problem is the church has lost its way of navigating this kind of space, and so has left it wide open. And then, because quite rightly, we support refugees and so on, but we don't also support the working class. If we did both, it should be a both-and approach. Then we would not be so alienated from those people.
Thank you. That's clear. You said you wanted to talk about class, and you've got it in at the end. Thank you very much. Andrew?
I was inspired at the beginning by your young conversion experiences that you related in your opening remarks. What advice, simple question, would you give to young Christians who are passionate about urban justice and want to take up the legacy of faith in the city today?
One of you answer that question. It looks like it's you, Rob.
I take a great sense of hope in the levels of questioning that many young people with a passion for justice bring, and I think we need to give them a platform. And we need to take the questions which are being asked, particularly relational questions being asked, really seriously, and not say, kind of, there, we know better. I think there's a power dynamic, particularly with that. So there is something about listening and about giving a platform for younger voices to be heard in this sphere.
Thank you. Thank you. The one sentence answer question. So in 1985, the church worked out with some clarity what it had to say to the nation. Today, in one sentence, if the church were to have something to say to the nation, what ought it be?
Okay.
Rob, please.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, Jesus Christ, that those who believe in him may not perish, but may have eternal life.
Thank you. That's put a smile on Tim's face. Tim.
To use a different kind of language, I would want to say to the nation, face your demons, come to terms with them, make peace with who you are, and live out of the angel of your better nature, opening your arms to the world, opening your arms to the poor, opening your arms to your story, and opening your arms to God.
Gosh, thank you.
I think I would say in a world where everything seems to be unraveling, where there's a struggle for a yearning for meaning and purpose, where everything seems uncertain, the tradition of the church, the Christian tradition, is a long-standing, deep tradition that will help you understand what it means to be a human being, and that is your identity is actually in God. And by exploring that story and that tradition through spiritual practices and the centuries of learning, it will enlighten you to a place of discovery and adventure.
Thank you very much, the three of you. Thank you for giving your time and coming along. I know an hour and a quarter is a short time, but I think we've got deep into the spirit of what was going on in 1985 and the needs of today. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Can we give them a round of applause? Anthony, when are you going to wrap up with when the next one is?
Yes. Yeah.
Over to you.
So just before we finish, Ruth and I wanted to just share a few things that might be coming up that are coming up that might be of interest. So Ruth, do you want to go first?
Yes, so Transforming Lives Together, we've got some Acorn Christian listening, which I think in the light of what we've been hearing actually will be really helpful for us to come and have that training so that we can listen really, really well to what people in our community are saying when they come to our places of welcome, when they come and encounter us, whether it's at church, whether we're out at the park, wherever we are, that we can listen really well to people. What are they saying? Because otherwise we'll project our view on the world, but actually it's really good to hear from the people that we encounter. So if you're interested in attending our Acorn Christian listening, there will be one in Ellesmere Port at St Thomas's on the 7th of November. Look out for that on the Transforming Lives Together website in the next few days, hopefully. And there's one on the Saturday on the 8th of November that will be taking place in Crewe. And then there's also one in January on the 17th, which is a Saturday, which will be in Partington in South Manchester. So if you can't make one, hopefully you can make the other one. It's a full day, 10 to 4, and we'd love you to sign up for that and come along.
Sorry, I just forgot to mention, there's a book called Celebrating 40 Years of Faith in the City. For those of you who are aficionados and really want to get stuck in, it's a really interesting collection of 13 chapters. It's edited by Terry Drummond and Joe Ford, who've both got a long history with this. I've got a chapter in it as well, but there's lots of other more estimable people than me that have written in this book.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to say, here at the Cathedral, coming up, there are a number of more thought-provoking and exciting talks and events. So next Friday, we are welcoming the poet and theologian J. Hume, who will be here in conversation here in the refectory next Friday evening. Do come along for that. He's really entertaining and a great poet. And then after that, at the beginning of October, we've got the Purgatory Project. So 2 days of a symposium. You can come to one of the days or the dinner and conversation in the evening. Some fantastic Dante experts helping us to explore what Dante's Purgatory has to say to us today, alongside a really exciting art exhibition. And then going a bit further beyond, middle of October, our next Assemble event like this will be exploring the question of, do prisons rehabilitate? And we're looking forward to welcoming our Police and Crime Commissioner and others to that panel. And then finally, when looking a bit further ahead again into November with Interfaith Week, and in light of some of the conversations tonight, I'm really delighted that we've got our next faith-to-faith conversation with the Lord Mayor and the Sheriff, one a devout Muslim, one a committed Christian, who will be in conversation about how their faith informs their everyday life and their work as well. So lots to look forward to, all on the website. Please do come along and join us again.